Sarah Mitchell never expected to find a 50-year-old cry for help hidden in a church hymnal, but sometimes the dead refused to stay buried. The discovery would shatter everything she thought she knew about her quiet Iowa town and force her to confront a truth that powerful people had killed to keep secret. The autumn dust swirled through shafts of amber light as Sarah climbed the narrow stairs to the First Baptist Church attic, her footsteps echoing in the silence above the sanctuary. Pastor David Wells had asked for volunteers to help restore the church's historical artifacts, and Sarah had eagerly signed up. After her recent divorce, she craved purpose, something meaningful to fill the hollow spaces her former life had left behind. The attic stretched before her like a forgotten museum, packed with decades of accumulated church life. Boxes of Christmas decorations sat alongside broken pews, their wood scarred but still bearing the warm patina of countless Sunday services. Sarah pulled on cotton gloves and began sorting through a collection of old hymnals, their leather covers, cracked and pages yellowed with age. She was halfway through a box labeled 1940s songbooks when her fingers found it, a hymnal that felt different from the others, heavier. As she opened the cover, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the dusty floor. Sarah retrieved it, her breath catching as she unfolded what appeared to be a hand-drawn map, sketched in fading pencil on church stationery, but it was the note scrawled at the bottom that made her blood run cold. They took us to the old Mercy Farm. Find us Jenny. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the hymnal more closely. The inside cover bore a stamp, Property of First Baptist Church Youth Group, 1944. Jenny's desperate message had been carefully tucked between the pages of Amazing Grace, as if she'd known someone would eventually find it there. The sound of footsteps on the attic stairs made Sarah quickly fold the map and slip it into her jacket pocket. Pastor Wells appeared at the top of the steps, his kind face creased with concern. "Finding anything interesting up here?" he asked, brushing dust from his sleeve. Sarah closed the hymnal, her heart racing. "Just old songbooks," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Pastor Wells, what do you know about the church youth group from 1944? His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a shadow passing across his features. "Why do you ask?" The Cedar Falls Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street, its rooms filled with the musty scent of old paper and forgotten memories. Sarah had barely slept the night before, Jenny's desperate note burning in her mind like an unanswered prayer. Pastor Wells's evasive response had only deepened her unease, and she knew she needed answers that wouldn't come from within the church walls. Martha Kowalski, the society's elderly curator, peered over her wire-rimmed glasses as Sarah explained her interest in the 1944 youth group. Martha's silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her cardigan bore the faint smell of lavender and old books. "November 1944, Martha murmured, her arthritic fingers dancing across index cards with practiced efficiency. "Yes, I remember. That case. Tragic business, really. The entire youth group, 23 teenagers, vanished after their Wednesday night Bible study. Just gone." Sarah's stomach tightened. What happened to them? Martha pulled a thick folder from a filing cabinet, its manila surface worn smooth by decades of handling. Officially, they were labeled runaways. The police investigation lasted all of 2 weeks before they closed the case. She opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings and faded photographs. But it never made sense to those of us who lived here then. These weren't troubled children from broken homes. They were good kids from respectable families. The newspaper headline from November 15, 1944, screamed in bold type, "Church Youth Group Missing. Police Seek Runaways." Sarah scanned the article, noting how quickly the narrative had shifted from missing to runaway, as if someone had been eager to control the story. 23 teenagers don't just decide to run away together, Sarah said, studying a group photograph of the youth group taken just weeks before their disappearance. Their faces were bright with youth and faith, unaware that death was stalking them. "Exactly what I always thought," Martha agreed, lowering her voice, "but powerful people wanted it buried." The police chief then was Harold Brennan Sr., current chief's father. He shut down any talk of foul play real quick. Pastor Wells appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, as if he'd hurried to find them. Sarah, I thought I might find... You here?" His smile seemed forced, not reaching his eyes. "I hope Martha's been helpful with your historical curiosity." The way he said curiosity made it sound like something shameful, something that should be suppressed. Sarah folded Jenny's note deeper into her pocket, suddenly grateful she hadn't mentioned it to him the day before. The Cedar Falls Police Department squatted on Main Street like a concrete fortress, its narrow windows and institutional grey walls designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Sarah pushed through the heavy glass doors, clutching the folder Martha had copied for her, each step echoing her growing determination to uncover what had really happened to those 23 teenagers. Detective Ray Thornton looked like a man, counting down his final days until retirement. His desk was already half cleared, personal photos packed in cardboard boxes, and his weathered face bore the resigned expression of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. When Sarah explained her request to review the 1944 case file, his eyes darted nervously toward the chief's office. "That's ancient history, miss," Thornton said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not sure what good digging it up will do now." "Those families never got answers," Sarah pressed. "Don't you think they deserved better than a 2-week investigation?" Something in her words seemed to pierce his professional armor. After a long moment, he stood slowly, his joints protesting. 5 minutes. That's all I can give you." The archive room smelled of mildew and forgotten crimes. Thornton pulled a thin manila folder from a filing cabinet, its meager contents a stark contrast to the thick files surrounding it. Sarah opened it with trembling hands, finding only a handful of witness statements, a brief police report, and a single photograph of the empty church basement where the youth group had last been seen. "This is it?" Sarah asked, incredulous. 23 missing children, and this is the entire investigation." Thornton's jaw tightened. Chief Brennan's father ran things different back then. Case was closed fast. Too fast, if you ask me. Which... Nobody did. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Chief Harold Brennan filled the doorway like a wall of authority. He was a large man with cold eyes and the kind of presence that made people instinctively step back. His gaze moved from Sarah to the open file, and his expression darkened. "Ray, what are you doing?" Brennan's voice carried the weight of decades in command. "Just helping a citizen with a records request, Chief," Thornton replied, but his hands shook as he closed the file. Brennan stepped closer, his bulk blocking the fluorescent light. "Miss, I don't know what kind of story you're chasing, but you're wasting your time. That case was solved 50 years ago. Those kids ran off during wartime. Happens more than you'd think." Sarah met his stare, feeling the familiar chill of institutional power protecting itself. "Solved? 23 teenagers vanish and you call that solved?" "I call it closed," Brennan said with finality. "And I suggest you do the same, for your own good." The gravel road stretched into the Iowa countryside like a scar across the autumn landscape, leading Sarah and her brother Tom deeper into farmland that seemed forgotten by time itself. Sarah clutched Jenny's hand-drawn map, its penciled landmarks, still visible after 50 years of hiding in that hymnal. Chief Brennan's warning echoed in her mind, but his obvious attempt to silence her had only strengthened her resolve. Tom Mitchell adjusted his surveyor's equipment in the back of his pickup truck, his weathered hands steady despite the gravity of their mission. As a land surveyor, he'd spent decades mapping every corner of Cedar Falls County, but he'd never seen his sister so driven by a cause. "You sure about this, Sarah?" he asked, studying the crude map over her shoulder. That cop seemed pretty serious about leaving it alone. "That's exactly why we can't," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "When authority figures threaten you for asking questions, it usually means you're asking the right ones." The map led them down increasingly narrow roads until they reached a rusted gate bearing a faded sign, "Mercy Farm, private property, no trespassing." The gate hung open, its chains long since broken, as if the land itself had given up trying to keep secrets. Beyond the gate, the remnants of what had once been a working farm stretched across rolling hills. A collapsed barn stood like a broken skeleton against the grey sky, and the foundation of a demolished farmhouse was barely visible through overgrown weeds. But it was the cluster of smaller outbuildings that drew Sarah's attention. structures that matched the crude sketches on Jenny's map. Tom pulled out his county records, cross-referencing property deeds with practiced efficiency. His face grew pale as he traced ownership history through the decades. "Sarah," he said quietly, "this property was owned by the Brennan family from 1923 to 1953. Harold Brennan Sr., the police chief who closed the case, this was his family's land." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The same man who dismissed 23 missing teenagers as runaways had owned the very property where Jenny's desperate note claimed they'd been taken. The coincidence was too precise, too convenient, to be anything but damning. They walked toward the largest outbuilding, a concrete structure partially buried in the hillside. Unlike the other ruins, this building remained largely intact, its heavy wooden door secured with a newer padlock that seemed oddly out of place on an abandoned farm. "Someone's been maintaining this place," Tom observed, running his fingers along the lock. "This chain's maybe 5 years old, Max." Sarah studied the building's design, noting the small barred windows set high in the walls and the reinforced data frame. This wasn't built to keep animals in. It was built to keep something else from getting out. The Cedar Falls nursing home smelled of disinfectant and forgotten dreams, its beige hallways lined with wheelchairs and the soft murmur of afternoon television programs. Sarah had spent the morning tracking down survivors from the 1944 youth group list, only to discover that most had died or moved away decades ago. Agnes Hartley was the last name on her list, and possibly her last hope for answers. They found Agnes in the sunroom, a frail woman of 67 whose silver hair caught the pale autumn light streaming through tall windows. Her hands, spotted with age, clutched a worn Bible, and her eyes held the distant look of someone who'd spent decades trying to forget what she'd seen. "Agnes," Sarah said gently, settling into the chair beside her. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm researching what happened to the First Baptist Youth Group in 1944. The old woman's entire body went rigid, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the Bible tighter. For a long moment she said nothing, her breathing shallow and rapid. "I don't talk about that," Agnes whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "I promised myself I'd never talk about that night." Tom leaned forward, his surveyor's training making him patient with details others might miss. "Agnes, we've found something at the old Mercy farm. We think other people might be in danger if we don't understand what happened." Agnes's eyes snapped to his face, suddenly sharp and alert. "You went to the farm?" Sarah carefully pulled out Jenny's note, unfolding it on the table between them. "We found this hidden in a church hymnal. Someone named Jenny left it for us to find." Agnes stared at the faded paper, tears beginning to stream down her weathered cheeks. "Jenny Morrison," she breathed. "Sweet Jenny Morrison, she was my best friend." The dam of 50 years' silence finally burst. Agnes began to speak in halting whispers, her words tumbling over each other as if she feared losing courage before the story was told. "They took us after Bible study," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Said there was a special meeting at the farm, something about helping with the war effort. But when we got there," she shuddered, "there were underground chambers. They made us work making things for the black market. Military supplies, ration books. Jenny tried to organize an escape." "How did you get away?" Sarah asked gently. Agnes's hand moved unconsciously to a scar on her neck, thin and white with age. "I was small, 14 and tiny. I squeezed through a ventilation shaft while they were punishing the others for Jenny's escape attempt." Her voice broke completely. "I left them all behind. I ran, and I left them all to die." The weight of survivors' guilt pressed down on the sunroom like a physical presence. Agnes looked directly at Sarah, her eyes fierce with decades of suppressed anguish. "They're still down there, aren't they? My friends are still in those chambers." Cedar Falls City Hall stood like a monument to small-town bureaucracy, its brick facade weathered by decades of Iowa winters and political scandals. Sarah and Tom climbed the worn marble steps with Agnes's testimony burning in their minds, armed now with specific details about the Brennan family's wartime activities. The old woman's words had transformed their investigation from curiosity into crusade. Rebecca Santos, the city clerk, was a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and the careful demeanor of someone who'd learned to navigate local politics. Without making enemies, she led them to the records room, where filing cabinets stretched from floor to ceiling like sentinels guarding the town's secrets. Business licenses and permits from the 1940s, Rebecca explained, pulling out drawer after drawer. What exactly are you looking for? Anything connected to the Brennan family operations during the war, Sarah said, watching Rebecca's expression carefully. Specifically activities at Mercy Farm. Rebecca's hands paused over a folder marked Brennan Enterprises, 1942-1945. She glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. You know Chief Brennan's been asking questions about who's been requesting old records lately. Tom stepped closer. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest you should be very careful, Rebecca replied, but she opened the folder anyway. Look, I've lived in this town my whole life. There've always been whispers about what the Brennans did during the war, but nobody talks openly about it. The documents inside the folder painted a picture of systematic corruption that made Sarah's stomach turn. Business permits for agricultural equipment manufacturing at Mercy Farm, contracts with mysterious companies that had no listed addresses, and payment records showing enormous profits during rationing shortages. Military equipment, Tom said, reading over her shoulder. They were manufacturing counterfeit ration books and selling black market supplies while boys from this town were dying overseas. Rebecca pulled out another document, this one bearing several official stamps. Here's the interesting part. Look at the inspection dates. The state sent investigators to Mercy Farm twice in 1944. Both times the reports came back clean, but look who signed off on them. Sarah studied the signatures, her blood running cold as she recognized the name. Harold Brennan Sr. in his capacity as both police chief and county safety inspector. He was covering for his own family's operation, she breathed, using his badge to protect their war profiteering. Gets worse, Rebecca said, pulling out a final document. Church volunteer records from November 1944. The youth group had signed up to help with patriotic manufacturing at Mercy Farm. They were supposed to be making care packages for soldiers. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The youth group hadn't stumbled onto the illegal operation by accident. They'd been invited there expecting to serve their country, only to discover they were being used to help cheat it. They saw too much, Tom said grimly. 23 kids found out about the black market operation and had to be silenced. Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed the documents with her camera. A family business built on blood money, protected by a badge, and when innocent kids threatened to expose them. They made sure those kids could never tell anyone, Rebecca finished quietly. She looked toward the door again, her face pale. Sarah, you need to be very careful. The current chief isn't just Harold Sr.'s son. He's been protecting this secret his entire career. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the key in her front door, the weight of the day's discoveries pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The small rental house on Maple Street had become her sanctuary after the divorce, but tonight it felt exposed and vulnerable. She'd spent the evening making copies of all the documents, hiding them in different locations throughout the house, driven by an instinct that danger was closing in. The sound of heavy footsteps on her front porch made her freeze. Through the window, she could see Chief Brennan's massive silhouette illuminated by her porch light, his presence radiating menace, even in stillness. When she opened the door, his cold eyes swept past her into the house, cataloguing and assessing. "Evening, Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "Mind if I come in? We need to talk." Sarah stepped back reluctantly, knowing that refusing would only escalate the confrontation. Brennan filled her small living room like a storm. Cloud, his uniform and badge symbols of authority that had protected his family's crimes for 50 years. "I hear you've been busy today," he continued, settling uninvited into her armchair. "City Hall, nursing homes, asking questions about ancient history that's best left buried." "I'm just trying to understand what happened to those kids," Sarah replied, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. Brennan's smile was arctic. "What happened is they ran away during wartime, end of story. Now I understand you've been carrying around some old church property, a hymnal, maybe some papers that don't belong to you." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. How did he know about Jenny's note? I don't know what you're talking about. See, that's where you're wrong. Brennan stood slowly, his bulk casting a shadow across the room. This is a small town, Sarah. People talk. Church volunteers report missing items. Pastors worry about their flock asking dangerous questions. The betrayal hit her like a slap. Pastor Wells had been watching her, reporting her activities to Brennan. The man she'd trusted with her spiritual guidance had sold her out to protect. Whatever dark compact existed between the church and the police. Those kids deserve justice, Sarah said, finding courage in her anger. Those kids are 50 years dead, Brennan snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping. Nothing you do will bring them back, but you can still protect yourself. Stop digging, return what you took from the church, and forget this ever happened. And if I don't. Brennan moved closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the cold calculation in his eyes. Then you might find yourself having the same kind of accident those kids had. Small towns can be dangerous places for people who don't know when to mind their own business. After he left, Sarah double-checked every lock and drew all the curtains. She was making coffee with trembling hands when she heard glass breaking in her bedroom. Heart pounding, she crept down the hallway to find her window shattered and her dresser drawers pulled open, contents scattered across the floor. Someone had searched her house while Brennan kept her distracted in the living room. Professional, coordinated, efficient. They'd found nothing. The hymnal and copies were safely hidden, but the message was clear: they could reach her anywhere, any time. As she swept up the broken glass, Sarah realized she'd crossed a line there was no going back from. The Brennan family would kill to protect their secret, just as they had 50 years ago. The midnight darkness at Mercy Farm felt alive with malevolent secrets, broken only by the narrow beams of their flashlights cutting through the autumn air. Sarah, Tom, and Detective Thornton moved like ghosts across the abandoned property, bolt cutters and Agnes's hand-drawn map guiding them toward a truth that had been buried for half a century. Thornton had appeared at Sarah's house after midnight, his weathered face etched with guilt and determination. "I've carried this shame for 30 years, he'd whispered. "When I joined the force, I asked too many questions about that case. Brennan made it clear that my career and my health depended on forgetting what I'd heard." Now he knelt beside the concrete building's padlock, his hands steady despite his obvious fear. "This is career suicide for me," he muttered as the bolt cutters snapped through the chain. "But those kids deserve better than the silence we gave them." The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo from the earth itself. Their flashlights revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness, the air below thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something that made Sarah's stomach turn. As they descended, the walls changed from poured concrete to rough-hewn stone, and she realized they were entering chambers that had been carved from the hillside itself. Agnes was right, Tom breathed, his surveyor's eye taking in the construction details. This whole operation was designed to be hidden, underground manufacturing invisible from the road. The main chamber opened before them like a nightmare made real. Rusted machinery lined the walls, printing presses for counterfeit, ration books, equipment for forging military documents, workbenches where desperate teenagers had been forced to aid in treason. But it was the smaller rooms beyond that broke Sarah's heart. Sleeping areas, if they could be called that. Concrete bunks with rotting mattresses, shackle points bolted to the walls and scratched into the stone, names, dates, desperate messages carved by fingernails and makeshift tools. Jenny Morrison, November 1944. "If anyone finds this, tell my mother I love her." David Chen, day 15. "They killed Bobby today for trying to escape." Susan Walker, "I can't count the days anymore. God forgive us all." Thornton played his flashlight across wall after wall of carved testimonies, his face grey with horror. Jesus Christ, they kept them here like animals. In the farthest chamber, Tom's light found something that made them all step back in revulsion. Human remains, scattered and incomplete, lay in a corner beneath decades of accumulated debris. Scraps of fabric that might once have been clothing, personal effects green with corrosion. 23 kids came here, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Agnes escaped, but the others—" "They worked them to death," Thornton said, his cops training overriding his emotional response, or killed them when they became too much trouble, then buried the evidence right here in the chambers. Sarah pulled out her camera, documenting everything despite her trembling hands. Each photograph was proof of a crime that powerful people had spent 50 years covering up, evidence that would finally give those murdered children a voice. From somewhere above them came the sound of car engines, multiple vehicles approaching fast across the gravel road. "We need to go," Thornton said urgently. "Now." But as they turned toward the stairs, Sarah knew they were already too late. The sound of heavy boots echoed from the chamber entrance, and Chief Brennan's voice boomed down into the darkness. "I warned you, Miss Mitchell. Some secrets are worth killing for." The pre-dawn escape from Mercy Farm had been a nightmare of running, through dark fields while police sirens wailed in the distance, but somehow they'd made it out with the photographs that would change everything. Now 3 hours later, Sarah sat beside Agnes Hartley's bed in the nursing home, the old woman's frail hand gripping hers with surprising strength as Thornton stood guard by the door. Agnes's eyes were bright with fever and determination, as if she knew her time for truth-telling was running short. The photographs from the underground chambers lay spread across her bedside table, like evidence in a tribunal of the dead. "I need to tell you the rest," Agnes whispered, her voice urgent, despite its weakness. "About what I saw before I escaped, about Harold Brennan Sr." Sarah leaned closer, her heart pounding as Agnes began to speak in a voice that seemed to grow stronger with each terrible revelation. "It was our 3rd week in the chambers. We'd been making counterfeit documents, working 16 hours a day, with barely any food. Jenny had been planning our escape for days, gathering information about the guards' routines. Agnes's fingers traced one of the photographs, showing the carved names on the chamber walls. The night I got out, she tried to lead a group of 8 kids through the main tunnel." Thornton moved closer, his weathered face grim. "What happened?" "To them?" Brennan Sr. was waiting. Agnes's voice dropped to a whisper, heavy with 50 years of survivor guilt. "He had his gun drawn, and when Jenny stepped into the main chamber, he didn't hesitate. Shot her right in the chest. She was 17 years old, and she died trying to save us all." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes as she thought of the desperate note Jenny had hidden in the hymnal, her final attempt to ensure someone would eventually learn the truth. "The other 7 kids with her," Agnes continued, "Brennan didn't kill them right away. He made phone calls. I could hear him from my hiding spot in the ventilation shaft. He was selling them, human trafficking. Young, healthy teenagers disappeared into labor camps and worse places during the war." The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of medical equipment and Agnes's labored breathing. Finally, Thornton spoke, his voice thick with rage and shame. "The current chief knows," he said. "Harold Jr. has been protecting his father's crimes his entire career. That's why he shut down every investigation, why he threatened you. He's not just covering up murder, he's covering up decades of human trafficking." Agnes turned her fierce gaze to Sarah. "You have to stop him. Harold Jr. has been using the same network his father built. Different crimes, but the same corruption. I've seen things over the years, reports in the newspaper about missing teens, cases that get closed too quickly." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew. "The trafficking never stopped," Agnes said, her voice breaking. "It just got more careful. Harold Jr. learned from his father's mistakes. He makes sure there are no survivors left behind to tell stories." The weight of Agnes's words settled over them like a shroud. They weren't just seeking justice for crimes from 1944. They were trying to stop an ongoing criminal enterprise that had been protected by badges and official silence for half a century. Agnes squeezed Sarah's hand one final time. "Promise me, you'll see this through. Promise me those children's deaths will finally mean something." The Cedar Falls Police Department felt different at 8 in the morning, its harsh fluorescent lights revealing every crack in the institutional facade that had protected the Brennan family's crimes for generations. Sarah walked through the front doors with Detective Thornton at her side, a manila envelope containing copied photographs and documents clutched against her chest like armor. Chief Brennan was waiting for them in his office, his massive frame silhouetted against the window overlooking Main Street. His desk had been cleared except for a single file folder and his service weapon lay beside it, not threatening but visible. A reminder of the power he still wielded in this building. "You should have listened to my warning," Brennan said without turning around. "Now you've forced me to take more permanent measures." Thornton stepped forward, his hand resting on his own weapon. "It's over, Harold. We have photographs of the chambers, Agnes Hartley's testimony, and business records proving your father's war crimes." Brennan finally turned, his cold eyes moving from Thornton to Sarah with the calculating gaze of a predator. "Ray, you're 3 days from retirement. Don't throw your pension away for this troublemaker." "My pension?" Thornton's voice cracked with bitter laughter. "Harold, those were kids. 17-year-old kids your father murdered and sold like livestock. There isn't a pension in the world worth staying silent about that." Sarah opened the envelope, spreading the photographs across Brennan's desk. Images of the carved names, the rusted shackles, the scattered remains. Evidence that spoke louder than any accusation. Brennan's face went pale as he stared at the documentation of his family's legacy. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "My family built this town. We kept order when nobody else could. Sometimes that meant making hard choices." "Hard choices?" Sarah's voice rose with indignation. "You call murdering children hard choices? Your father was a war profiteer and a killer, and you've spent your entire career protecting him." Brennan's hand moved toward his weapon, but the sound of multiple car doors slamming in the parking lot made him freeze. Through the window, Sarah could see men in dark suits and FBI windbreakers surrounding the building. Thornton smiled grimly. "I made some calls before we came here, Harold. The state police and FBI have been very interested in cold cases involving missing children, especially when there's evidence of ongoing criminal enterprises." The office door burst open, and Agent Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 40s with steel-grey eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to confronting corruption, stepped inside with 2 other agents behind her. "Chief Brennan," she said, her voice carrying federal authority, "you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder, and violation of civil rights under color of law." As the handcuffs clicked around Brennan's wrists, he looked directly at Sarah with pure hatred. "This isn't over. You have no idea how deep this goes, how many people were involved. Taking me down won't change anything." Agent Morrison read him, his rights while Sarah watched 50 years of protected corruption finally crumble. But Brennan's words echoed in her mind. How many people were involved? The network of silence that had protected his family's crimes couldn't have been maintained by one man alone. As they led Brennan away, Sarah realized the confrontation was won. But the war for justice was just beginning. The Iowa autumn sky hung heavy with gray clouds as the state forensic team worked methodically across Mercy Farm, their white tents and careful grids transforming the abandoned property into a cathedral of evidence. Sarah stood at the perimeter with Agnes, who had insisted on being present despite her frail health, her wheelchair positioned so she could witness the final excavation of secrets she'd carried alone for 50 years. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead, forensic anthropologist, approached with the careful reverence of someone who understood she was recovering more than bones. She was restoring dignity to forgotten children. Her team had been working for 3 days, and each discovery brought both heartbreak and validation to Agnes's testimony. "We've confirmed 22 sets of remains," Dr. Rodriguez reported quietly. "Ages consistent with teenagers, all showing signs of malnutrition and several with evidence of violence. The preservation is remarkable due to the underground conditions." Agnes gripped the arms of her wheelchair, tears streaming down her weathered face. 22, she whispered. Jenny and 21 others, they're finally coming home. Families had begun arriving throughout the morning, elderly parents and siblings who had spent decades wondering what happened to their children. Margaret, Chen, now 83, clutched a faded photograph of her brother David as she watched the careful excavation. "I knew he wouldn't have run away," she said to Sarah, her voice breaking. "David was going to be a minister. He would never have abandoned his faith." The personal effects the team recovered told stories more powerful than any testimony. A class ring engraved Cedar Falls High 1945, a graduation its owner would never see. A small silver cross necklace that Agnes immediately recognized as belonging to Jenny Morrison, a pocket watch that made Margaret Chen sob with recognition. "That was our grandfather's," she said, pointing to the tarnished timepiece. "David carried it everywhere. Said it reminded him that every minute was a gift from God." Tom approached Sarah, his surveyor's knowledge having proven invaluable to the excavation team. "They found something else," he said quietly. "Dr. Rodriguez wants you to see it." In the deepest part of the underground chamber, the forensic team had uncovered what appeared to be a makeshift altar, a wooden cross carved with the names of all 23 youth group members, including Agnes. Jenny Morrison had created a memorial to her friends, even while being held captive, a final act of love and remembrance. "She never stopped being our leader," Agnes said, when she saw the cross. Even at the end, Jenny was thinking of all of us. As the day wore on, more families arrived to reclaim their children's remains. The scene was both heartbreaking and healing. 50 years of unanswered questions finally put to rest. 50 years of guilt and wondering, transformed into grief that could finally be processed and honored. Dr. Rodriguez approached Agnes one final time as the sun began to set. "Mrs. Hartley, we found this with Jenny Morrison's remains." She held out a small piece of paper, protected in an evidence bag. "It appears to be another note, written just before she died." Agnes read the faded words through her tears. "Agnes, got away. Tell the world what they did to us. Make sure our deaths mean something. Jenny." The message that had taken 50 years to deliver was finally complete. The sanctuary of First Baptist Church had never held such a gathering, 500 people packed into pews that had witnessed decades of Sunday services, but never a memorial for 22 murdered children whose names had been whispered in shame for 50 years. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across faces wet with tears of grief and relief. Sarah sat in the front row beside Agnes, whose wheelchair was positioned where she could see the memorial wall Pastor Wells had created. 23 photographs lined the altar, formal school portraits of teenagers whose bright eyes and hopeful smiles belied the horror that awaited them in November 1944. Jenny Morrison's picture held the center position, flanked by a small wooden cross and the original hymnal, where her desperate message had waited half a century to be found. Pastor Wells approached the pulpit with obvious discomfort, his involvement in the cover-up having cost him the trust of his congregation. He'd resigned the previous week, but the families had asked him to perform this final service, a last chance at redemption. "We gather today not just to mourn," he began, his voice heavy with shame and sorrow, "but to acknowledge our community's failure to protect these children and our silence in the face of evil that wore badges and carried authority." Agnes gripped Sarah's hand as the pastor spoke, her fingers strong despite her age. The old woman had found peace in recent weeks, the lifting of 50 years of survivor guilt visible in her face like sunlight after a long storm. Chief Patricia Morrison, the Beau, FBI agent who had arrested Harold Brennan and taken over as interim police chief, stood to address the gathering. Her presence represented more than law enforcement. It symbolized the possibility of justice uncompromised by local corruption. "The investigation continues," she announced. "Harold Brennan Jr. has provided information about ongoing criminal enterprises that his family protected for decades. Other arrests are coming. This community's nightmare is ending, but vigilance must continue." As families came forward to place flowers beside their children's photographs, Sarah reflected on the journey from that dusty church attic to this moment of acknowledgement and healing. The cost of hidden truth had been enormous. 22 young lives, 50 years of lies, and a community's soul corroded by complicity and silence. Agnes spoke quietly beside her, her voice carrying across the sanctuary, despite its weakness. Jenny's message was finally delivered. They can rest now. Outside, autumn leaves danced in the wind around the church where it all began. Sarah touched the empty space in her jacket pocket where Jenny's note had lived for weeks, and she understood that some discoveries change everything, not just for those who make them, but for everyone who chooses to listen. The healing would take time, but the silence was finally broken.